I remember the way the light from the television painted everything blue and gray that night. The sound was turned down so low it was just shapes moving across the screen, meaningless flickers that neither of us were really watching. The living room felt smaller than usual, heavy with the weight of too much beer and too many unspoken words. Two empty bottles sat on the coffee table between us like evidence of something we hadn't quite confessed to yet. My hands wouldn't stay still. I kept rolling the label off my third bottle, the paper damp and stubborn under my fingertips. The motion was automatic, nervous, something to do with the energy that had nowhere else to go. I could feel Marcus watching me from across the room, and that made my fingers work faster, peeling away strips of paper that fell onto my lap like small surrenders. He was slouched back in his chair the way he always did when he'd had too much to drink, but there was something different about his posture tonight. His shoulders weren't quite as relaxed as they pretended to be. His eyes, even heavy with alcohol, kept finding mine and then darting away. We'd known each other for 26 years, since we were 8 years old and stealing candy from Peterson's corner store, and I'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression like weather patterns. The silence between us had weight, not the comfortable quiet of old friends who didn't need to fill every moment with words, but something thicker, something that pressed against my chest and made breathing feel deliberate. I wanted to say something, anything, to cut through whatever was building in the space between his chair and my spot on the edge of the sofa, but my throat felt closed. Then Marcus shifted forward slightly, and his voice came out rougher than usual, slurred at the edges but strangely clear in its intention. He said he'd been thinking about us, about things he'd wondered about but never had the courage to say out loud. He said he'd been wondering what it would be like with me. The words hung in the air like smoke, visible and toxic and impossible to take back. My hand stopped moving entirely, the bottle label half peeled and forgotten. The world had tilted somehow, gravity pulling everything toward this moment I'd imagined 1,000 times, but never believed could actually happen. I looked at him and saw something I'd never seen before. Vulnerability, yes, but also a kind of hunger that made my stomach drop. This was Marcus, who had been the center of my universe since before I even understood what that meant. Marcus, who had dated girls throughout high school while I pretended to be interested in anyone else. Marcus, who had married Evelyn and built the life I'd always watched from the outside. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it over the whisper of the television. Every cell in my body was screaming yes, finally, yes, while my mind raced through all the reasons this was impossible, dangerous, wrong. I'd spent 18 years protecting this friendship by keeping my feelings buried so deep I sometimes forgot they existed at all. Now here he was, drunk and reckless, and offering me the thing I'd never dared to ask for. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The moment stretched between us like a bridge I was terrified to cross, because I knew that once I took that step, there would be no going back to the safety of not knowing. The fantasy of possibility was about to collide with the brutal reality of choice, and I had no idea which one would survive. The air in the room felt different now, charged with something electric and dangerous. I could smell the beer on his breath from across the space between us, could see the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. The label in my hand was completely destroyed now, nothing but sticky fragments clinging to my palm. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here we were, two men in their 30s, sitting in his living room while his wife was at her sister's house and his children were asleep upstairs, and he was asking me the question that had lived in the deepest, most hidden part of my heart for half my lifetime. Another part of me wanted to run, to grab my keys and drive home and pretend this conversation had never happened, that we could go back to being just friends who never crossed certain lines. But I stayed frozen on the edge of that sofa, caught between the boy I'd been at 16, watching him kiss Sarah Martinez under the football bleachers and feeling something crack inside my chest, and the man I was now, 34 and tired of carrying secrets that grew heavier every year. Marcus was still looking at me, waiting for something. An answer, maybe, or a sign that I wasn't about to run screaming from the room. His face was flushed from the alcohol, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been all evening. He looked scared, I realized. Scared and hopeful and drunk enough to finally say the thing that sober Marcus would never risk. The television flickered to a commercial, bright colors washing over us for a moment before fading back to the blue-gray shadows. In that brief flash of light, I saw him exactly as he was. Not the untouchable object of my longing, but a man as lost and confused as I'd always been. A man who had just handed me his own secret and was waiting to see what I would do with it. I should tell you about the life I'd built around that moment. The careful architecture of restraint that had brought me to Marcus's living room that night. At 34, I had perfected the art of living quietly. My days were measured in lesson plans and coffee cups, in the predictable rhythms of a small town where everyone knew your name and half your business, but never quite enough to matter. Every morning, I drove the same route to Jefferson High School, past the same houses with their neat lawns and American flags, past Peterson's corner store where Marcus and I had once been 8-year-old thieves, past the Methodist church where my parents still expected me to appear every Sunday like clockwork. The school building was brick and functional, built in the 1970s when the town still believed it might grow into something larger than it was. Now it felt frozen in amber, full of the children of people I'd grown up with, teaching them the same lessons their parents had learned in the same classrooms. I taught English to teenagers who looked through me most days, their minds already focused on escape routes I'd never quite managed to find. They wrote essays about their dreams of college in distant cities, about careers that would take them far from the place that had shaped them. I graded their papers with a mixture of encouragement and envy, knowing that at their age I'd already learned to want smaller things, safer things, things that wouldn't require explanations I couldn't give. My house sat on Elm Street, a modest 2-bedroom with white siding and a front porch I never used. Inside, the rooms were filled with books and silence. Stacks of novels lined every wall, classics and contemporary fiction arranged without any system except the order in which I'd acquired them. They were my companions and my refuge, other people's stories to distract me from the one I wasn't living. The second bedroom had become my office, where I spent evenings grading papers and weekends reading, the space lit by a single desk lamp that cast long shadows across pages of careful cursive and typed assignments. The silence in that house was profound, not peaceful but heavy with absence. No footsteps except my own, no voices calling from other rooms, no sounds of a life shared with another person. I'd grown so accustomed to it that when friends visited, their laughter and conversation felt foreign, too loud, like music played in the wrong key. My parents, still alive and living 20 minutes away in the house where I'd grown up, had long since stopped asking direct questions about my personal life. Instead, they offered pointed observations about my solitude. My mother would mention, with studied casualness, that the Henderson's son had married his college girlfriend and how happy they looked together. My father would note that a man my age should be thinking about settling down, about carrying on the family name. These conversations felt like gentle interrogations, sessions where I was expected to confess to failures I couldn't quite name. Marriage, in their minds, was a duty I had neglected, a social contract that remained mysteriously unsigned. They spoke of it as if it were a matter of timing rather than desire, as if the right woman simply hadn't crossed my path yet. I let them believe this fiction because it was easier than the truth that would require them to rebuild their understanding of their only son. Through all of this, Marcus had been the constant. Our friendship was the golden thread that connected my present to my past, the one relationship that had survived every transition and change. We still met for beers on Friday nights when his schedule allowed, still took fishing trips to the lake where we'd learned to cast lines as boys. He would talk about his work at the insurance company, about Evelyn's attempts to renovate their kitchen, about his daughter's soccer games, and his son's struggles with algebra. I would listen and ask questions and offer advice, playing the role of the devoted friend who lived vicariously through his experiences. When he complained about domestic responsibilities or the chaos of family life, I would make sympathetic noises while secretly envying every moment of mess and noise he described. His problems seemed like luxury to me, the kind of complications that came from having too much life rather than too little. Evelyn had always been kind to me, including me in birthday parties and holiday dinners with the casual assumption that of course I would be there. I was Marcus's oldest friend, practically family, the bachelor uncle who could be counted on to bring thoughtful gifts and stay late to help with dishes. She sometimes mentioned women she thought I might like, colleagues or friends of friends who were single and available, and I would deflect these suggestions with practiced ease. The town itself had become a kind of prison made of familiarity. Every street corner held a memory. Every building housed people who had known me since childhood. The annual festivals and church picnics, the high school football games and community theater productions, all of it felt like an elaborate performance in which I played the part of a man living a normal life. I knew my role perfectly. The reliable teacher, the loyal friend, the dutiful son who simply hadn't found the right woman yet. But underneath this careful construction, I had buried my truth so deeply that sometimes I convinced myself it didn't exist at all. The feelings I'd carried for Marcus since we were teenagers had become like an underground river, always flowing but hidden from view, surfacing only in unguarded moments when I would catch myself watching him too intently or feel a surge of jealousy when he mentioned time spent with other friends. The weight of this life wasn't dramatic or tragic in any obvious way. It was the quiet suffocation of small compromises made daily, the gradual erosion of possibility under the steady pressure of expectation. It was Sunday morning church bells that called me to services where I sat alone. Christmas cards featuring happy families that reminded me of the life I'd never built. Conversations about the future that always seemed to stop short of any real revelation. This was the man who had found himself in Marcus's living room that night, surrounded by empty beer bottles and the dangerous promise of finally, after all these years, being seen. The invitation came on a Thursday afternoon in late September, delivered with the casual tone Marcus used for all his suggestions, as if he hadn't just offered me the thing I'd been unconsciously waiting for my entire adult life. He called while I was grading sophomore essays about their summer vacations, their cheerful accounts of family trips and summer jobs scattered across my kitchen table like evidence of lives more colorful than mine. He said he'd been thinking about the lake house. His voice had that particular quality it took on when he was trying to sound spontaneous about something he'd clearly been considering for a while. The place had been sitting empty since his father-in-law's death the previous spring, and Evelyn kept saying someone should go up there, make sure everything was still in working order. Maybe we could make a weekend of it, he suggested. Just the two of us, like the old days. My hand tightened around the phone as I listened to him paint the picture. We could take the boat out if the weather held, maybe do some fishing, definitely do some serious drinking away from the responsibilities that seemed to multiply every year. It would be good for both of us, he said, to get away from everything for a few days. When was the last time we'd had a proper conversation without his kids interrupting or my phone buzzing with school emails? I found myself saying yes before I'd fully processed what I was agreeing to. The word came out automatically, bypassing the part of my brain that should have recognized the danger in spending an entire weekend alone with Marcus at a place that held so many memories of our shared past. Instead, I heard myself expressing enthusiasm I didn't entirely feel, making plans for a trip I both desperately wanted and genuinely feared. After we hung up, I sat surrounded by those half-graded essays and tried to understand what had just happened. The rational part of my mind began cataloging all the reasons this was a terrible idea. A weekend alone with Marcus, away from the familiar boundaries of our usual environments, seemed like an invitation to disaster. For 26 years, I'd managed our friendship by carefully controlling the circumstances of our time together. Group settings, public places, situations where the intensity of my feelings could be diffused among other people and distractions. But there was another part of me, a part that had been dormant for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed, that felt suddenly, dangerously alive at the prospect. 2 days of Marcus's undivided attention, of conversations that might go deeper than our usual careful exchanges about work and weather and safe topics that never ventured into territory that might reveal too much. When I mentioned the trip to my mother during our usual Sunday phone call, she responded with the kind of pleased surprise she reserved for any evidence that I was engaging with life beyond my books and classroom. She said it sounded wonderful, that I worked too hard and needed to relax more. She didn't ask why Marcus was going without Evelyn, didn't question the arrangement in any way that suggested she saw anything unusual about two grown men spending a weekend together at a lake house. Her easy acceptance somehow made me feel both relieved and slightly guilty, as if I were deceiving her by not explaining my real reasons for anticipation. The week leading up to the trip passed with agonizing slowness. I found myself distracted during lessons, losing track of conversations with colleagues, unable to concentrate on the novel I was supposedly reading in the evenings. Every time my phone rang, I half expected it to be Marcus calling to cancel, to say that Evelyn had changed her mind or that something had come up with the kids. But the call never came. Friday afternoon arrived gray and overcast, with the kind of October chill that hinted at the winter waiting just around the corner. I packed with unusual care, second-guessing every choice. How many changes of clothes did one need for a weekend that might change everything? What did you bring to a place where you might finally have to face truths you'd spent decades avoiding? Marcus picked me up at my house at 4 o'clock, his truck loaded with groceries and beer and fishing equipment that looked like it hadn't been used in months. He seemed different somehow, less settled than usual, as if he too sensed that this weekend held possibilities that our normal Friday night beers never offered. He talked more than usual during the 2-hour drive, filling the silence with observations about the changing leaves and memories of previous trips to the lake with his father-in-law. The lake house sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by pine trees that had grown taller and thicker since our last visit 3 years ago. It was a simple place, nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom cabin with a screened porch that faced the water. The kind of place where time moved differently, where the usual urgencies of daily life seemed suddenly irrelevant. We unloaded the truck in companionable silence, carrying bags and groceries into the familiar space that smelled of old wood and dust, and the particular mustiness that comes from a place left empty too long. Marcus moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, opening windows to let in the cool air, checking that the electricity and water were still working, settling into the ritual of making the place habitable again. That first evening passed easily enough. We cooked steaks on the ancient propane grill, opened the first of many beers, and sat on the porch watching the sun set over water that reflected the sky like a mirror. The conversation stayed in safe territory initially, updates on work and family, shared memories of previous visits to this same spot when we were younger, and the future seemed both more distant and more certain. But as the evening wore on and the beer loosened our usual careful boundaries, I began to notice the way Marcus looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. There was something different in his expression, a kind of searching quality I'd never seen before, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he'd only recently become aware of. When our conversation lulled, instead of the comfortable silence I was accustomed to, there was a tension that made the space between us feel charged with possibility. Later that night, lying in the narrow bed in the smaller bedroom while Marcus settled into the master suite where he'd slept during family visits, I stared at the ceiling and wondered what exactly I'd gotten myself into. The walls between us seemed thinner than they should have been, and every sound from his room seemed amplified in the darkness. I could hear him moving around, the creak of floorboards, the sound of a window being opened. It was going to be a long weekend. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes in October, the air sharp and clean and full of the promise of a perfect day. I woke to the sound of Marcus moving around in the kitchen, the familiar domestic sounds of coffee being made and bacon sizzling in a pan. For a moment, lying in that narrow bed with sunlight streaming through windows I'd forgotten to cover, I could pretend this was just another ordinary weekend with my oldest friend. But when I emerged from the bedroom, still rumpled from sleep and squinting against the morning light, Something in the way Marcus looked at me made it clear that nothing about this weekend was going to be ordinary. His smile was the same one I'd known for 26 years, but there was something different behind it now, a kind of awareness that hadn't been there before. He handed me a cup of coffee with the casual intimacy of someone who knew exactly how I liked it prepared, but his fingers lingered against mine just a moment longer than necessary. We ate breakfast on the screened porch, plates balanced on our laps while we watched the lake's surface catch and scatter the morning light. Marcus talked about his plans to fix the boat motor that afternoon, complained good-naturedly about Evelyn's latest home improvement projects, mentioned that his son had finally started showing interest in fishing. All normal conversation, the kind we'd had hundreds of times before, but every word seemed to carry additional weight now, as if we were speaking in code about things we couldn't yet name directly. I found myself studying his face as he talked, memorizing details I'd somehow never noticed despite knowing him for most of my life. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident I'd witnessed but forgotten, the way he absently rubbed his jaw when he was thinking. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt completely present in a moment instead of existing at a careful distance from my own life. The guilt started almost immediately. Here was Marcus, trusting me with his weekend, his solitude, his friendship, and I was sitting across from him cataloging the curve of his mouth like a teenager with an impossible crush. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that I was reading meaning into gestures that were probably innocent, that I was projecting my own long-buried feelings onto interactions that meant nothing more than they ever had. But then he would catch me looking at him, and instead of glancing away with the slight embarrassment that usually accompanied such moments, he would hold my gaze just long enough to make my heart skip. When he reached across the small table to refill my coffee cup, his arm brushed against mine, and neither of us moved away. These tiny contacts felt electric, charged with possibility I'd never dared to imagine. By afternoon, as Marcus worked on the boat motor with the focused concentration he brought to any mechanical problem, I realized I was experiencing something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost forgotten it was possible. I felt alive, not just existing, not just moving through the motions of a life carefully constructed to avoid disappointment, but genuinely, vibrantly alive in a way that made every sensation seem heightened. The smell of pine trees and lake water, the sound of tools against metal, the warmth of October sunshine on my skin, all of it felt more real than anything I'd experienced in months. When the motor finally turned over, sputtering to life after 20 minutes of patient coaxing, Marcus looked up at me with such pure joy that I had to turn away to hide my expression. This was dangerous territory, I knew. This feeling of connection, of being seen and appreciated for simply being present, was exactly what I'd spent my adult life learning to live without. That evening, as we prepared dinner together in the small kitchen, our conversation began to shift into territory we'd never explored before. Marcus asked me, while we were chopping vegetables for a salad, if I ever got lonely living by myself. The question came out casual enough, but there was something underneath it that suggested he'd been wondering about this for a while. I gave him a careful answer about enjoying my solitude, about having plenty of social contact at work and through our friendship. But he pressed gently, asking if I never missed having someone to come home to, someone to share the daily details of life with. His questions felt both intrusive and oddly intimate, as if he was trying to understand something about me that had always puzzled him. Then, as we sat down to eat, he asked the question that stopped me cold. He wanted to know what it was like, living the way I did. Always so private, he said, always keeping certain parts of myself hidden. He'd noticed it over the years, he claimed, the way I would sometimes seem to disappear even when I was sitting right there with him. The way I deflected certain types of conversations, changed the subject when things got too personal. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. This was the closest anyone had ever come to directly acknowledging the truth I'd worked so hard to conceal. I looked at Marcus across the small table, trying to read his expression in the fading light, and saw something that looked like genuine curiosity mixed with what might have been concern. I told him that everyone had things they preferred to keep private. that some people were naturally more reserved than others. Half-truths and deflections that I'd perfected over years of similar conversations. But this time, they felt heavier, more dishonest. Marcus nodded as if he accepted this explanation, but his eyes suggested he was hearing the things I wasn't saying as clearly as the words I was. After dinner, we built a fire in the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the living room. Marcus had always been good with fires, patient with kindling and careful about airflow, and I watched his hands as he arranged the logs with the same focused attention I'd observed that afternoon with the boat motor. The flames caught and grew, casting dancing shadows across the room and creating the kind of intimate atmosphere that seemed designed for conversations that wouldn't happen anywhere else. We settled into the old leather chairs that flanked the fireplace, glasses of whiskey in hand, and for a while we just watched the fire consume the wood with quiet efficiency. The silence between us felt different from our usual comfortable quiet. There was anticipation in it, a sense that we were both waiting for something to happen, though neither of us seemed quite ready to take the first step. Then Marcus began talking about his marriage in a way I'd never heard before. Not complaining exactly, but reflecting on the ways that intimate partnerships could become routine over time. The way people could live together for years and still sometimes feel like strangers to each other. He wondered aloud if everyone felt this way sometimes, if the deep connection he'd imagined marriage would provide was something that actually existed or just a romantic fiction people told themselves. I listened without offering the usual platitudes about all marriages going through difficult phases. Something in his tone suggested he wasn't looking for reassurance, but for genuine understanding. When he paused, looking into the fire as if it might hold answers to questions he was just learning how to ask, I found myself speaking more honestly than I had in years. I told him that loneliness wasn't necessarily about being alone, that sometimes the most profound isolation came from being surrounded by people who could only see the version of yourself you felt safe showing them. The words came out before I could stop them, more revealing than anything I'd intended to say. Marcus turned to look at me then, and something in his expression made my chest tight. He said he'd always suspected I understood things about solitude that he'd never had to learn, that there were depths to me he'd sensed but never been invited to explore. We sat with that observation hanging in the air between us, the fire crackling and settling as the logs were consumed. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, he asked if I'd ever wanted to tell him something but held back because I was afraid of how he might react. The question hit me like a physical blow. Here was the opening I'd simultaneously longed for and dreaded my entire adult life, the invitation to finally speak the truth that had lived in the shadows for so long. But instead of relief, I felt a surge of panic so intense it took all my self-control not to get up and walk outside into the cold night air. I managed something about everyone having private thoughts, private feelings that weren't meant to be shared. But my voice came out unsteady, and I could see that Marcus heard the tremor in it. He leaned forward in his chair then, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the way the firelight reflected in his eyes. Without saying anything, he reached out and placed his hand on my knee. The world went completely silent. Not just quiet, but as if all sound had been suddenly sucked out of the universe. The fire still flickered, the lake still lapped gently against the shore outside, but I couldn't hear any of it over the thundering of my own heartbeat. His hand was warm through the fabric of my jeans, solid and real and impossible. I stared down at it, afraid that if I looked up at his face, I would see something there that would either break my heart or change everything forever. His thumb moved slightly, just a small gesture of comfort or reassurance, and I felt something inside me begin to crack open like ice in spring thaw. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, connected by that simple touch that somehow contained everything I'd never been able to say. I could feel the careful boundaries I'd spent decades constructing beginning to dissolve, could sense something dangerous and necessary taking shape in the space between us. When I finally looked up at him, Marcus was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not pity or curiosity, but something that looked almost like recognition, as if he was finally seeing a part of me that had always been there but hidden. The closeness between us felt like both salvation and the edge of a cliff I wasn't sure I was ready to jump from. I still couldn't tell if what I saw in his face was genuine desire or simple loneliness, couldn't distinguish between sincere affection and the kind of experimentation that comes from being drunk on solitude and whiskey. But for the first time in my life, it didn't matter. Whatever was happening between us in that moment, whatever it meant or didn't mean, I was finally, terrifyingly present for all of it. It happened so quietly that for a moment I wasn't entirely sure it had happened at all. 1 second we were sitting by the fire, his hand warm and steady on my knee, the weight of unspoken truths settling between us like smoke. The next second, Marcus was leaning forward, closing the distance between our chairs with the deliberate slowness of someone who was giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't pull away. His lips touched mine with the tentative pressure of someone testing the temperature of unfamiliar water. Not passionate, not desperate, but careful in a way that suggested he understood exactly how fragile this moment was, how easily it could shatter if handled roughly. The kiss lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe 30. Time seemed to fold in on itself, making it impossible to measure anything beyond the shocking reality of connection I'd imagined thousands of times, but never truly believed would happen. When he pulled back, his eyes were wide with something that looked like surprise, as if he hadn't quite planned this moment either, as if it had simply emerged from the charged atmosphere we'd been building all weekend. We stared at each other across the small space that separated our chairs, both of us breathing a little too quickly, both of us seeming to wait for the other to react first. My entire body felt electrified, every nerve ending suddenly awake in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. The taste of whiskey and something essentially Marcus lingered on my lips, and I had to resist the urge to touch my mouth, to confirm that this had actually happened. 26 years of friendship, 18 years of carefully buried feelings, and it had come down to this. A kiss by firelight that felt both like the most natural thing in the world and like the most impossible. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as something he did when he was nervous or uncertain. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, as if the kiss had changed something fundamental about the way words formed in his throat. He said that maybe we'd had too much to drink, that things had gotten a little intense, a little confused. He said it didn't have to mean anything if I didn't want it to. The words hit me like cold water thrown on the fire that had been building in my chest. Didn't have to mean anything. As if the most significant moment of my adult life could be dismissed as easily as a mistake in judgment, a temporary lapse in the careful boundaries we'd maintained for so long. As if the kiss that had just rewritten the entire history of our friendship was something that could be taken back, forgotten, filed away under the category of things that happen when two lonely people drink too much whiskey in an isolated place. But I understood why he said it. Marcus was protecting both of us, offering an escape route from whatever dangerous territory we'd just entered. He was giving me the option to pretend this hadn't happened, to wake up tomorrow morning and return to the safety of our old dynamic. It was generous, really. It was exactly what a good friend would do. I managed to nod, to make some sound that might have been agreement, though I'm not sure what exactly I was agreeing to. That the kiss hadn't meant anything? That we could pretend it hadn't happened? That we were both just drunk and lonely and making poor decisions? None of those things felt true, but I didn't have words for what did feel true, so I let his interpretation stand unchallenged. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, careful dance of normalcy. We finished our whiskey. We talked about safe topics like work and weather and the logistics of driving back to town the next day. We banked the fire and turned off the lights and said goodnight like we had hundreds of times before. But underneath the familiar routines, everything had changed. The air between us hummed with possibility and terror in equal measure. In my narrow bed in the smaller bedroom, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and replaying those few seconds over and over, examining every detail like evidence in a case I was trying to solve. The way his eyes had looked in the firelight just before he leaned forward, the slight tremor in his hand when it had moved from my knee to cup the back of my neck, the sound he'd made, barely audible, when our lips had finally met. I could hear him moving around in the next room, the creak of floorboards and the rustle of sheets that suggested he was having as much trouble sleeping as I was. Part of me wanted to get up, to knock on his door, to continue the conversation we'd started by the fire. But a larger part of me was paralyzed by the magnitude of what had already happened, by the fear that pushing for more might destroy even the fragile connection we'd just discovered. Sometime after midnight, I gave up on sleep entirely and made my way quietly to the bathroom, careful not to make any noise that might wake Marcus or, worse, invite conversation I wasn't ready to have. The small bathroom was lit by a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows and made everything look stark and unfamiliar. I stood in front of the mirror above the sink and barely recognized the man looking back at me. My hair was disheveled from lying restlessly in bed. My eyes were bright with something that might have been fear or excitement or both. But it was more than just physical appearance that looked different. For the first time in my life, I was seeing someone who had been kissed by the person he'd loved for half his lifetime. Someone who had stepped, however briefly, out of the shadows where he'd been hiding for decades. The man in the mirror looked exposed in a way that should have been terrifying, but somehow wasn't. All the careful construction I'd built around my feelings, all the elaborate defenses I'd maintained to keep my truth safely buried, had been stripped away in the space of a single kiss. I felt raw, vulnerable, like I'd shed a skin I hadn't even realized I'd been wearing. But along with the vulnerability came something I hadn't expected, a kind of relief so profound it took my breath away. For 34 years, I'd been carrying a secret that felt too dangerous to share, too impossible to speak aloud. The weight of it had become so familiar I'd stopped noticing how heavy it was, how much energy it took to maintain the careful distance between who I was and who I allowed others to see. Now, standing in that small bathroom with the taste of Marcus still lingering on my lips, I realized I could never go back to pretending those feelings didn't exist. Whether or not tonight had meant anything to him, whether or not it led to anything more than awkward avoidance and the slow dissolution of our friendship, I could no longer return to the silence I'd lived in for so long. The kiss had changed something fundamental in me, had shifted the tectonic plates of a life built on careful concealment. Even if Marcus wanted to pretend it had never happened, even if he spent the rest of our friendship treating it as a mistake born of whiskey and loneliness, I would always know that for one moment, the impossible had been possible. That for 3 seconds or 30, I had been seen and wanted by the person who mattered most. I splashed cold water on my face and looked at myself one more time. The man in the mirror still looked unfamiliar, but in a way that felt like coming home rather than losing himself. For the first time in my adult life, I was looking at someone who had stopped hiding, even if only from himself. Back in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Marcus finally settling into sleep in the next room, I realized that whatever happened next, I had crossed a line I could never uncross. The careful architecture of restraint I'd built my life around had developed a crack that would only widen with time. The man who had kissed Marcus by the firelight was not the same man who had driven up to the lake house 2 days ago, and there was no going back to who I'd been before. The terror of that realization was matched only by the strange, unexpected peace it brought. After 18 years of silence, I had finally been given permission to feel everything I'd been holding back. Even if it meant the end of the friendship that had defined my adult life, even if it meant rebuilding everything I thought I knew about who I was, I could no longer pretend that love this deep could be safely contained forever. The kiss had lasted only seconds, but its reverberations would reshape everything that came after. In the darkness of that small room, listening to my own heartbeat gradually slow towards something resembling normal, I understood that I had just experienced the moment that would divide my life into before and after, the instant when everything I thought I knew about possibility had been rewritten by the simple, revolutionary act of being kissed back. Sunday morning came too soon and not soon enough. We packed the truck with the careful efficiency of 2 people who had become suddenly formal with each other, as if the kiss by the firelight had turned us into polite strangers rather than friends who had known each other for 26 years. Marcus focused intently on securing the fishing equipment, double-checking that windows were locked, making sure the cabin was left exactly as we'd found it. I folded my clothes with unnecessary precision and swept the floors that didn't really need sweeping. The drive back to town stretched longer than the 2 hours it actually took. We talked about safe things, the condition of the boat motor, whether the weather would hold for another week, plans Marcus mentioned for bringing his family up to the lake next summer. Everything carefully normal, deliberately mundane, as if we could rebuild the comfortable distance between us through sheer determination to pretend nothing had changed. But something had changed, irrevocably and completely. The silence between us carried weight now, filled with everything we weren't saying about what had happened in front of that fire. Every casual comment felt loaded with subtext. Every glance held the potential for misinterpretation. When Marcus dropped me off at my house, our goodbye was brief and awkward, lacking the easy warmth that had characterized our partings for decades. I watched his truck disappear around the corner and knew, with a certainty that felt like cold water in my veins, that everything between us was different now. Not necessarily ruined, but fundamentally altered in ways that couldn't be undone or ignored. The man who walked into my empty house that Sunday afternoon was not the same person who had left on Friday, full of nervous anticipation about a weekend that might or might not mean anything. The following weeks confirmed what I'd sensed during that uncomfortable drive home. Marcus began avoiding me with the subtle skill of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating social situations he'd rather escape. Our usual Friday night beers were canceled due to work obligations or family commitments that might or might not have been real. When I called, our conversations were shorter, more stilted, filled with the kind of careful pleasantries we'd never needed before. He was protecting himself, I realized, and probably protecting me too. The kiss had opened a door between us that neither of us knew how to walk through, and his solution was to pretend the door had never existed at all. It was rational, probably wise, certainly safer than any alternative I could imagine, but it left me feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The silence between us became a living thing, growing larger and more oppressive with each day that passed without genuine contact. I found myself analyzing every interaction, searching for signs that the easy intimacy of our friendship might eventually return, while simultaneously understanding that it never could. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and Marcus was making it clear that his solution was to retreat to safer ground. My classroom became a refuge from the constant awareness of what I'd lost. Standing in front of teenagers who had their own complicated lives and messy emotional situations helped me maintain some perspective on my own situation. Their essays about first loves and broken friendships reminded me that I wasn't the only person in the world struggling to understand the difference between what we want and what we can actually have. But the empty house waited for me every evening, filled with the same books and the same silence, now made more profound by the absence of even the possibility of Marcus's voice on the phone. I had thought loneliness was something I'd grown accustomed to over the years, but this was different. This was the specific ache of knowing exactly what I was missing, of having tasted connection only to have it withdrawn. 3 weeks after the lake weekend, I found myself driving through Marcus's neighborhood without any clear intention of stopping. It was the kind of November evening when darkness comes early and families gather around dinner tables, when the warm glow of house windows makes the outside world feel particularly cold and uninviting. I told myself I was simply taking a different route home from the grocery store, but when I turned onto his street, I knew I was lying to myself. His house looked exactly as it always had, modest, well-maintained, the kind of place where normal families lived normal lives. Through the kitchen window, I could see the shapes of Marcus and Evelyn and their 2 children gathered around the table, probably sharing the details of their days, probably planning the evening's activities. The scene looked warm and complete, like something from a magazine about domestic happiness. I sat in my car across the street, engine running, heat turned up against the November chill, and felt the full weight of what had been risked during those few seconds by the fireplace. This was Marcus's real life, the wife he'd chosen, the children he'd helped create, the responsibilities and commitments that defined who he was in the world. What we'd shared at the lake was separate from this, disconnected from the actual architecture of his existence. For a moment, I considered knocking on the door. I imagined myself walking up to that front porch, ringing the doorbell, being invited in to join their family dinner as I had dozens of times before. I pictured sitting at their table, making conversation with Evelyn about her work, helping the kids with homework, pretending that nothing had changed between Marcus and me. It would be a kind of test, perhaps, to see if we could find our way back to the friendship we'd had before everything became complicated. But I didn't get out of the car. Instead, I sat there watching the warm tableau through their kitchen window and understood, with painful clarity, that the friendship I was mourning was already gone. Even if Marcus and I managed to rebuild some version of our old connection, it would always be shadowed by the knowledge of what had passed between us, always constrained by the need to avoid any situation that might lead us back into dangerous territory. I drove home through streets that seemed darker than usual, past houses where other people were living lives that made sense to them, lives that didn't require constant navigation around truths too dangerous to speak aloud. My own house felt smaller when I walked through the front door, the silence more oppressive than it had been in years. That night, instead of grading papers or reading or doing any of the things that usually filled my evening hours, I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began to write. Not a letter to Marcus, though that's what I'd initially intended. Not an explanation or an apology or an attempt to salvage what remained of our friendship. Instead, I found myself writing to the person I'd been before that weekend at the lake, trying to explain what I'd learned in the weeks since. I wrote about the 18 years I'd spent protecting Marcus from my feelings, believing that keeping my truth hidden was an act of love rather than an act of cowardice. I wrote about the careful architecture of restraint I'd built my life around, and how a single kiss had revealed how much energy it took to maintain walls that high and that strong. I wrote about the loneliness that came from being seen only partially, and the even greater loneliness of finally being seen completely only to have that vision rejected. The words came slowly at first, then faster as I found myself confessing things I'd never admitted even to myself. I wrote about the fantasy I'd carried for so long of Marcus somehow recognizing and reciprocating my feelings, and the painful relief of finally understanding that love didn't work that way, that wanting someone wasn't the same as being compatible with the life they'd chosen. Most importantly, I wrote about the choice I'd been avoiding since we'd returned from the lake. I could keep protecting Marcus's comfort by pretending the kiss had never happened, by accepting his retreat into safe distance, by rebuilding our friendship on the foundation of mutual pretense. Or I could finally step into the truth that I deserved a life that was entirely my own, even if it meant accepting a different kind of loneliness than the one I'd grown accustomed to. The letter grew longer as the night deepened, pages and pages of honesty that felt both liberating and terrifying. When I finally set down my pen, sometime after 2 a.m, my hand was cramped and my heart was racing, but something inside me felt lighter than it had in weeks. I folded the pages carefully and placed them in the wooden box where I kept important documents, knowing I would probably never read them again, but understanding that writing them had been necessary. The choice was no longer about Marcus, about whether he would ever be able to return the feelings I'd harbored for so long. The choice was about whether I would continue to live as someone who kept his most essential truth hidden, or whether I would finally allow myself to exist as a whole person, even if that person had to exist alone. Dawn came slowly that morning, the sky lightening by degrees from black to deep gray to the pale silver that promised a clear December day. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter I'd written to myself folded neatly beside a steaming cup of coffee, watching the world outside emerge from darkness like a photograph developing in slow motion. The house was perfectly quiet, the kind of deep silence that only exists in the early hours before the rest of the world wakes up and begins the daily business of living. For once, the silence didn't feel oppressive or lonely. It felt clean, expectant, like the pause between one movement of a symphony and the next. My phone lay face down on the table, the message I'd typed but not sent glowing behind the dark screen. 3 words that contained 18 years of hidden truth. I loved you. Past tense, because I'd finally understood that love sometimes meant accepting what couldn't be, rather than fighting for what shouldn't be. The words were true, had always been true, would probably always be true in some fundamental way that had nothing to do with possibility or reciprocation. But I didn't need to send them. The truth was mine to carry now, not a burden to be hidden, but simply a fact about who I was and who I'd been. Marcus deserved his chosen life, his family, his carefully constructed happiness. And I deserved the chance to build something authentic from the pieces of the life I'd been living in careful fragments. I picked up the thin gold band I'd been wearing on my right ring finger for the past 12 years, the ring I'd bought for myself during a particularly difficult period when the questions from well-meaning colleagues and family members about my single status had become too persistent to deflect. A prop, really, a small piece of theater designed to suggest a life more conventional than the one I was actually living. When people noticed it, I would offer vague explanations about a relationship that had ended, about not being ready to take it off yet. The fiction had been easier than the truth, for them and for me. Now I held the ring up to the pale morning light, this symbol of a life I'd never lived with a person who had never existed. The metal was warm from my skin, worn smooth from years of unconscious turning when I was nervous or uncomfortable. It had been such a small deception, really, but like all the small deceptions I practiced, it had required constant maintenance, constant awareness of the lie I was telling simply by existing. I opened the small wooden box where I'd placed the letter, nestling the ring beside the folded pages like an artifact from a museum exhibit about the person I used to be. The box had been my grandfather's, made of dark walnut with brass hinges that had grown loose with age. It seemed appropriate that it should hold these remnants of my carefully constructed past, the confession I'd finally written and the symbol of the pretense I was finally ready to abandon. Without the ring, my hand looked different, paler where the metal had blocked the sun, somehow more honest in its nakedness. I flexed my fingers and felt lighter, as if I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't realized was there until it was gone. The coffee was still hot, bitter and strong the way I'd learned to like it during those long nights of grading papers and wondering what other people's lives felt like from the inside. I sipped it slowly, savoring the ritual of morning caffeine and the view of my neighborhood emerging from sleep. Mrs. Patterson was already moving around her kitchen across the street, probably starting breakfast for her husband before he left for his shift at the plant. The Hendersons' porch light was on, suggesting someone had an early commute to somewhere I'd never think to ask about. All these lives happening parallel to mine, each person carrying their own collection of truths and compromises and small daily choices that added up to something they could call a life. For 34 years, I'd watched from the sidelines, participating just enough to avoid suspicion, but never enough to risk genuine connection. The careful observer, the supportive friend, the reliable colleague who could always be counted on but never quite known. I thought about Marcus, probably asleep in the bed he shared with Evelyn, surrounded by the evidence of the life he'd chosen and built with intention and commitment. In a few hours, he would wake up and help get his children ready for school and drive to his office and spend his day solving other people's problems with insurance claims and policy renewals. A good life, an honest life, one that made sense within the boundaries he'd established for himself. Our friendship had been real, I realized, even if it had been built on my careful concealment of essential truths. The years of conversations and shared experiences, the fishing trips and late-night phone calls and moments of genuine connection, none of that had been false. Exactly, just incomplete. I'd offered him the parts of myself I felt safe sharing and held back the rest, and he'd responded to what I'd shown him with the kind of loyalty and affection I'd always craved. The kiss at the lake had been real too, whatever it meant to him. For those few seconds, the careful distance between us had collapsed entirely, and we'd encountered each other without the usual protective barriers. It had been beautiful and terrifying and unsustainable, and I was grateful for all of those qualities equally. But it was over now, had been over since the moment he'd said it didn't have to mean anything. Not because he was wrong, Love didn't require reciprocation to be valid, but because I'd finally understood that my happiness couldn't depend on someone else's ability to see and accept all of who I was. That was work I had to do for myself. The sun was fully up now, casting long golden rectangles across my kitchen floor and warming the side of my face, turned toward the window. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, calling people to Sunday services I'd stopped attending months ago, when the weekly performance of faith I didn't feel became too exhausting to maintain. I picked up my phone and deleted the unsent message to Marcus without reading it again. The words disappeared from the screen as if they'd never been written, but I could still feel their weight, their truth, their finality. They belonged to me now, part of the interior landscape I was finally learning to navigate without shame. Standing up from the table, I felt something shift inside me, subtle but unmistakable. The world looked the same. Same kitchen, same view through the window, same life waiting to be lived, but my relationship to all of it had changed. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't hiding from myself. Wasn't constructing elaborate defenses against truths too dangerous to acknowledge. Wasn't pretending to be someone simpler and safer than who I actually was. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. This feeling of standing fully in my own life without apology or explanation. I had no idea what came next, what it would mean to live as someone who had stopped hiding. But I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from finally telling yourself the truth, that I was ready to find out. The quiet settled around me like a blessing, no longer the silence of concealment, but the peace of acceptance. Whatever happened next, whoever I became, would be built on the foundation of this moment. A man at his kitchen table at dawn, finally choosing himself.